I'm Rob Coons, and for those of you that were here at 5:30 expecting the lecture to start at 5:30, I apologize. In the early publicity, we did have a 5:30 date. A lot of people called me and said they couldn't make it here at 5:30, and could we please move it back to 6? So I tried to get all the publicity changed. Certainly the web stuff and the things in the newspaper say 6. But if you, again, I apologize if you've came early. We will start promptly at 6, so it'll only be 30 minutes of your life, and hopefully it'll be worthwhile. And I'm very gratified to see such a good turnout here tonight. A couple things to mention, too, before we get started. There is some literature now, and if you came early, it wasn't there, on the tables just outside this door. One of our sponsors is the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, the Jack Miller Center there. And so there's some student guides to the curriculum, little booklets. And those are all free for the taking. So if you're interested in any of those, we've got political philosophy, U.S. history, law, religious studies. I think that's all we've got right now. So those are all free. We also have, in case you haven't picked these up yet, let's see, where's my, oops, I don't have my little, you can see some little orange bookmarks around the room. Those are also available out there if you don't have any. Those give you the rest of our lecture series that we're sponsoring. We still have 5 very important lectures coming through the rest of the calendar year. So please pick up one of those before you leave. I've also got this little yellow card. Again, there's some of those are available in the back. This is in case you'd be interested in getting on either an email list or an old-fashioned snail mail list to receive reminders about the lectures, and also about other things that may be coming up that both the Western Civ program and Phi Beta Kappa may be sponsoring. We're thinking actually right now about some sort of a conference in the fall, perhaps. May or may not involve some major presidential candidates. So in case if that develops, you might be interested in finding out about that, and getting on our mailing list would be a way to make that possible. Finally, if you do get very interested in this Western civilization, great books sort of program that we're creating, we are definitely looking for help to expand that and to both extracurricularly and also by way of bringing in visiting scholars. So I have some envelopes here for the development office at the College of Liberal Arts. And if you'd like to send us some money and on the memo line say something about Western Civ program, you'll definitely get to us. Or if you'd just like to send UT monies for other purposes, this is also a useful way to do that, and free for the taking. Okay, how am I doing time-wise? Well, it's a few minutes early. People, I'm sure, will be coming in who didn't get the misleading publicity, and so I'll go ahead and get started so that we'll have more time for our main speaker, Dr. Hanson. This is a series that's being sponsored by a number of different people. The sort of lead sponsor is the Phi Beta Kappa chapter here at the University of Texas, the Alpha of Texas chapter. And we've been sponsoring a series through 06 and 07 concerning the essence of a liberal education and how to define the core of that, something that is an abiding value of Phi Beta Kappa that's always stood for liberal education, and I think is very timely considering the fact that the University of Texas is in the midst of revising and rejuvenating its core as we speak. And I need to use this to advance it. There we go. One of the purposes is just to let people know about Phi Beta Kappa, in case you have student children or you yourself a student here at UT, children or other people that you know about. It's very well known in the older, smaller liberal arts colleges back east, but not so well known out here. It is, in fact, the nation's oldest and most prestigious honor society. So, accept no substitutes to Phi Beta Kappa. There are many imitations, but there's only one that was founded in 1776 at Williams and Mary College. And there are chapters at 270, actually a little bit more than that, elite colleges in the university, across the country. And as you can tell from our name, we're the very first chapter in Texas, Alpha of Texas. We were founded in 1904. So if you do, or your child does get some invitation to Phi Beta Kappa, you should take it very seriously. It's a very important honor. We have about 60 faculty and staff at UT who are members, including some very prestigious faculty and members of the administration, and about 50 UT students who are active, and we hope to increase that substantially. We've changed the election criteria so that we can elect more juniors to Phi Beta Kappa here at UT, so that we're hoping to build up an active student chapter. So if you're elected then, we hope that you can be more active in these lectures, seminars, and so on. Philosophy, the Guide of Life is the motto of Phi Beta Kappa, and it's limited to those who are pursuing a liberal education in the arts and sciences. So at the moment, College of Liberal Arts, College of Natural Sciences, and a few majors in fine arts. The Alpha of Texas chapter is sponsoring this particular series to raise the question about what the value and purpose of liberal learning is. The pursuit of knowledge that fulfills our human nature as opposed to that which is simply devoted to making money. Our co-sponsors in this particular lecture series are UT's new program in Western Civilization and American Institutions, which is a concentration at the moment. And more or less coincidentally, I'm both the president of the Alpha of Texas chapter of Phi Beta Kappa and also the director of this program. So that's why the two are involved in this lecture series simultaneously. UT's Humanities Institute has also been very big help. Humanities Texas has given us a grant for this. The National Phi Beta Kappa Society, the Jack Miller Center at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute that I mentioned earlier, and the Phi Beta Kappa Alumni Association of Greater Austin. I think that's everyone. I hope I didn't miss out. The Western Civilization program is a new concentration that was approved by the Faculty Council last spring. We've got 40 affiliated faculty from 13 different departments and schools, classics, government, philosophy, English, and so on. And it's anchored in a focus in the great books of the Western tradition, something along the University of Chicago, Columbia kind of model. Culminates in a comprehensive study of American institutions, especially the Constitution, but also family, religion, politics, and so on. We're beginning a junior fellows program for undergraduate students to have opportunities to interact with scholars, visiting scholars like Dr. Hanson. And we have a website, which, of course, you have to have these days. So for more information, it's pretty easy to remember, really. It's COLA, College of Liberal Arts, PROGS for programs, and then Western Civ, and that'll get us to the website. So tonight, our speaker, and I'll get back to him in just a few minutes, is Dr. Victor Hanson, who's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, and gave his blog as well. Author of a number of books. Again, we'll talk about that in a minute, including, most relevantly for us, Who Killed Homer and the Bonfire of the Humanities. In April 10th, Professor Y.T. Dimmock, who's a professor of English and American Studies from Yale, will be talking about ancient tragedies and modern catastrophes after Troy. In September 20th, Professor Martha Nussbaum from the University of Chicago Law School and author of Cultivating Humanity. October 11th, Michael Berube from Penn State University, author of Higher Education Under Fire, and a new one that's called What's So Liberal About Liberal Education? So, very relevant. November 8th, Daniela Allen, Dean of Humanities from the University of Chicago. And December 6th, Herbert London from the Hudson Institute, and the former dean and actually the founding dean of the Gallatin School at NYU. So, talk about this very relevantly. Victor Davis Hanson will also be at the Dallas Institute of Humanities tomorrow at 6 p.m. Fortunately, I just heard that they're sold out, so if you don't already have reservations, you won't be able to make it, I'm afraid. Yes, we've actually raised all the costs for this series, so I'd be lying to you if I told you we needed more money for that. But there are other things that we would like to be doing, obviously, and your gifts would be very much appreciated. And you could also give to Phi Beta Kappa for that matter as well. The yellow response card would be very helpful to us. That would enable us to give you reminders of upcoming events, let you know about new events that are being produced, a few by invitation only events that we could let you know about. And we'll keep you updated about developments in our Western Civ program. We're hoping to create some alumni seminars. In fact, the Western Civ program is working with the UT Quest program to offer some seminars on the philosophies of the founders, starting in late March through April and May. So if you know about the UT Quest program, you might check that out as well. And there will be a follow-up discussion, as there has been in each of these lectures in the lecture series, and that's February 21st, so it's next Wednesday from noon to 1 in the Union Eastwoods room. And lunch will be provided, pizza, quite good pizza. This definitely draws the grad students in significant numbers, but I want to encourage the undergraduate students also that it's worthwhile. Last time we had a very interesting discussion about the place of great books, great texts in education today, how exactly to understand that. So tonight's speaker, we're very excited, and obviously you are too, since you're here, to bring Dr. Victor Davis Hanson to us. from the Hoover Institution, Professor Emeritus from Cal State Fresno. He was an NEH Fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, one of the very top social science positions. The 2006 Nimitz Lecturer in Military History at UC Berkeley. Most recent book, which I read myself a few months ago, we have a couple copies on display out there, A War Like No Other, How the Athenians and Spartans Fought the Peloponnesian War. We also have, there are some books available by Dr. Hanson besides this at the Follett's bookstore, the intellectual property store up at Guadalupe, and they should be offering that at some sort of a discount, 10% discount, I think, as a result of the lecture series. So if you have some time after lecture, you could stroll up there. It's within walking distance. Have a look at that. So I've taken up enough time and appreciate your patience with me. So let me turn it over now to Dr. Hanson. Let's come up. Thank you. Okay, thank you. And do you have the button on? Should be. Good, very good. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that introduction and for coming out tonight. I'll try to speak for 35 or 40 minutes and then entertain any and all questions. Never know what that means. Last time I said that, the first question was the Afghanistan pipeline. The second one was Halliburton. And then the lecture was on ancient Greece. But anything's fine. What do we mean by Western civilization? Well, surely don't mean any more race. After all, the idea of it came from the southeastern quadrant in Europe by people who looked pretty much like present-day Mexican Americans, Italians. They surely didn't look like my ancestors, blue-eyed, blonde hair, who were illiterate at the time, killing people with abandon up in Scandinavia. I can say that because I'm not in Minnesota tonight. But it's not, and especially when you look at the world today, Japan seems to be Western. China, at least, is embracing Western ideas of economics, investment, free market capitalism, which was a Western idea. And it doesn't mean it's not geographical then. And originally it was people who were on the western side of the Aegean. They said that that's where the sun set. And a very parochial idea. So it's not geographical. Anybody can be Western. The Greeks themselves understood that. They said barbarians, which wasn't really a racial term. It just people who talked as if they were saying bar, bar, bar. They could be Western in a way that Greeks could not be Persian. I think that's true today. As I look out at this audience, I can't think of an audience. So many different races, probably different religions, quality of gender. I don't think this could happen tonight in the Congo or Rwanda or the Balkans even, or Iraq or Afghanistan. Yet we would all be sectarian or killing each other. I mentioned this not long ago, and a woman got up who was a Chinese immigrant and said that, well, she'd had problems in the United States because she didn't feel that she fit. She wasn't blonde-haired, blue-eyed. And I got very interested, so I went back and looked at the latest U.S. census. It's so-called white, whatever that means today, and it doesn't mean much anymore in some cases. 68% of the census. And I just asked her, would it be easier for you to become an American, or could I go to China and be fully accepted as Chinese? Or does Chinese culture still put a higher premium on race and appearance than Western culture? I know these are controversial ideas, but I think they're inherent in Western culture at the very beginning. Second thing is, Western culture is not the oldest or the most predominant culture. It's only 2,500 years old. We know settled civilization in the Near East, we can date it back 7,000 plus years. Not only is it not the oldest, there's no guarantee that it need continue. Now, I know in the age of globalization, everybody thinks it's almost inevitable that everybody wants Levi's or Starbucks or personal freedom. We even had Mr. Fukuyama, who I think still believes that we were at the end of history and that the logical result of the Greeks was an era of unlimited affluence and personal freedom, and that everybody was coming our way after the end of the Cold War. I guess we should be in sort of a period of euphoria, 21st century. All the great isms and ologies that had plagued Western civilization for centuries were sort of dealt with in the 19th and 20th century. It was the first civilization to eradicate slavery. Still exists in parts of the world, I'm told, parts of places like the Sudan, parts of the Arab world even. It ended this challenge from both the left and the right, this internecine challenge by German fascism, Italian fascism, Japanese militarism, and of course Soviet totalitarianism, Maoism. That plague cost 100 million people. More people were killed in the 20th century than all other wars in the history of Western civilization, and yet more people were killed in the 20th century off the battlefield than on. Violently, I mean, by Hitler and Mao and Stalin put together. So it should be in a period of relaxation, of triumphalism. It withstood all of these challenges, both ideological, racial, ethnic, geographical, other paradigms of civilization. We look at economically, I can't think of a time in the history of civilization that we in the West have been so prosperous. We have completely redefined poverty. Before I came here, I was thinking to myself, I drove into my hometown, which is 90% Mexican-American or Mexican national, and I live in the same place that my great-great-grandmother lives, and I can both see the poor section of town and the poor section of my home. And my house, which is 130 years old, is sort of a history of the United States, and I can think of all the letters people wrote about going out in the outhouse at night, the great discovery of electricity in 1915 when the house was wired, the septic tank in 1925. And if I grew up in a country school, all of my friends had at least one outhouse. And I used an outhouse until about 20 years ago on the farm. I'd be put in jail if I had it today. And the sheer effects of globalization, where people have access to capital and without credit checks. I went in to buy a car the other day, and a person drove out with a $35,000 Toyota Tundra club cab, and I remarked, and I said, what was the person's credit rating? He said he had none. I said, why would you loan him? He said, because we put a device on the car, and he can drive it as long as he makes a $700 payment. And when it doesn't, the GPS shuts it down. So whatever we're saying, that we have solved some elemental things. I know that we have a poverty, but it's often a poverty of opportunity and spirit. People who are poor don't have the opportunity to travel, of education, but the sheer material substance that so baffled most of civilization, and does today, hot water that doesn't have bacillus in it, rudimentary medical care. I went and had a broken arm 3 years ago, and I went to the emergency room. I was the only person there who spoke English and had medical insurance. And yet everybody in that medical emergency room had access to first-rate care in one way or the other. We don't like to talk about that, and there's inequalities, but what I'm trying to suggest is whatever you think of Western civilization, it has reached a period where it has survived challenges that were existential, and it's provided a modicum of prosperity and security for millions of people that were undreamed of. And yet, we seem to be in a period of deep pessimism, which is also quite typical. That there is this strain in Western civilization because of its very success at providing goods and services and free expression of the individual, freedom of opportunity, that if we are not perfect, we don't feel that we're any good. Utopianism, which is remember, it doesn't mean utopia, good place. It's no place. It can't exist. But yet it's what we all strive for. And we have challenges to Western civilization today. Within the West, there are breaking apart two different strains of it. There's a European, violently anti-American, and an American that's almost oblivious that anybody would ever dare to be anti-American. We tend to see Western civilization with more emphasis on the individual, on Christianity, on limited government, on the values of the market. The Europeans are emphasized in this other strain of Western civilization more on egalitarianism, the benevolent role of the state, the triumph of logic, the Enlightenment, at the expense of what they would say would be superstition. And as we in the West are fighting for the soul of Western civilization, not sure, we have a challenge today in the Middle East and the Muslim world of 1 billion people at large. And while it does seem that globalization is Westernization, the second great Westernization, remember the first was Romanization, that put columns and amphitheaters and habeas corpus in places like Libya and the Euphrates in Gaul, Well, we have this second globalization that's trying to westernize the world. And it's deeply offensive, apparently, to people in the Middle East. I was looking at the Al-Qaeda Reader that's coming out double date, and I was reading all of the things that bin Laden objects to. I was reviewing a book by a colleague at the Hoover that I think is, if I can say, I just reviewed it and I was published last week. I thought it was reprehensible by Dinesh D'Souza, blaming us because of the left. But I was curious to see if his argument held that bin Laden committed 9/11 because we're decadent and we all watch Brokeback Mountain. And he didn't like that. Forget the idea that I don't like polygamy or Sharia law and I don't feel I have to go blow somebody up. So somebody wants to watch Brokeback Mountain, more power to them. But the point is, if you read what he said about Western civilization, it was fascinating. It wasn't just that we had troops in the Holy Lands in 2003 in Saudi Arabia. It wasn't just that we starved the Iraqi children with the UN oil for food, but we did things like not sign the Kyoto Accord. We dropped a bomb on Hiroshima. We were guilty of white racism. We charge interest. This sounded like according to that, you should think that Al-Qaeda was a left wing and not a fundamentalist right wing. And he was objecting to the conservative element of the United States rather than its left wing element. But what summarized my point is that the Muslim world is very angry, at least some elements are, at what they see as the success of Western civilization. For the first time in your life in the Middle East, if you turn on the TV, you see Westernism. You have a TV, you have the internet, you have cell phones, you have DVDs, and they show you that life is pretty affluent and pretty good in places not just in San Francisco and Paris, but in Seoul, Korea. Places like Colombia, places like South Africa, places like China, Japan, but not so much in the Middle East. And out of that anger, an existential anger, an elemental anger, there is certain grievances. We in classics would call them prophases, perceived grievances, but some people would disagree with that. But my point is that we are at a point where there's a lot of challenges today within the West and without the West. And so I think it would be good just to ask ourselves, what is Western culture? I thought I was going to be really smart once, about 15 years ago at Cal State Fresno. I said I'm going to have a lecture called What is the West and What is Westernism? And when I started, about 25 to 30 people walked out thinking it was going to be Sam Peckinpah came from Fresno, and they thought it was going to be about the Wild Bunch, which I would have rather liked to talk about, I guess. But we use that term very promiscuously. But what we are not talking about, again, is geography or race or a venerable old culture, but a system of protocols, values, ideals. Now, it doesn't do any good to say, well, there was democracy in Europe in 800 AD, therefore it's not Western. We're not talking about the entire menu all the time over 2,500 years. Who could with the Holocaust or the Inquisition? But we're talking about a blueprint that is adopted, rejected, modified, embraced, but never completely gone from the beginning in classical Greece. So what are those protocols? It does seem that people in the West have a greater likelihood to embrace constitutional government. Now, we don't want to use the word democracy because we say that all democracy in the Middle East today are plebiscites. And of course, democracy is just a form of constitutional government. We could call it consensual government, some type of constitution that allows rights, and then the people can decide under what circumstances those take place. There seems to be a greater tendency to have a civic control of the military. I can't think of one Greek general, not one, who wasn't exiled or killed or had his property confiscated. And they can be Lysander in Sparta or Epaminondas in Thebes or Pericles at Athens, the great three triad of 5th and 4th century Greece. So there is this tendency of the civilians to control to a greater degree. I know there's Hitler and I know there's Alexander the Great, but by and large, there's always a critique of those people in the West in a way that's not as true as of alternate paradigms. There seems to be a greater likelihood to have some relation between religion and politics, where we're not as theocratic. There's a secular tradition. There's a rational tradition where we try to explain natural phenomenon according to what we call reason. It's what people criticize us, that we're cold-blooded. We do, in the best of Western civilization, put aside a sanctuary for belief. After all, I can tell you, if I read enough, what causes cancer, perhaps, but I can't tell you why I have cancer yet and you don't, or I don't have cancer and you do. There has to be some element of the mysterious that we relegate to religion. There always has been in the West. It's a very tense and sometimes unstable relationship, but it's different. It's not so hierarchical or pyramidal or theocratic as the alternatives. There's also a great respect for private property, having something owned in your name. I'll talk about that in a minute. And free economic activity. We don't seem to have as many restrictions, ethical and moral, on things like buying and selling things or charging interest. Free market capitalism, I know we're not supposed to use that word until the 18th century, but there are precursors both in Rome and Greece that are unique in the ancient world and have a long tradition that survives. It's no accident why David Hume's work, Adam Smith, is replete with references to Greece and Rome. There's also, it seems to me, a great emphasis on the individual and free expression. Not just religious expression, but free critique, always questioning why things are the way they are. That seems to be very important. There's a chauvinism of the middle class. The Greeks had this word, the mesoi, or the ta messe, the middle guys, the middle things, that there was sort of an idea that it's not socially desirable to have a pyramidal society. Everybody on the bottom and a few people at the top of the pyramid. That is deeply ingrained, that egalitarian strain within Western civilization. Where does this thing come from? How do we get it? Well, we can all identify it in the United States today and the other strain in Europe, or the two strains within the United States, in red state and blue state America. And we can see the antitheses of it, whether it's tribalism, or I said radical Islam, or theocracy, or some type of government-centered totalitarian alternative. So we can see it in our own country in Europe. We can trace it very easily to the Founding Fathers, Madison, Franklin, Hamilton, Jefferson. We can see their symbiosis with the French, British, Scottish Enlightenment, David Hume, as I said, Adam Smith, John Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu. We can see that throughout the period of monarchy there was questioning of it. We see the artistic and literary and musical expressions of things like the Renaissance, that freedom. We can even see early political reform and republicanism in the Venetian, Florentine republics during the Renaissance. We see divine right of kings, Magna Carta, the divine right of kings question, the Magna Carta. The Roman Empire, while it was autocratic, even in the provinces there were still elections being held in some cases. The Roman Republic is the great model which tried to reform or correct the perceived inadequacies of Greek democracy or Greek constitutional government. And then we get to Greece in the 7th, 6th, and 5th century where this thing began, and we stopped. Now, I know some of you are going to say, well, wait a minute, isn't Greek architecture influenced by the Egyptians? Yes. Isn't Greek mythology owe a lot to Asia Minor? Yes. And even India and other areas. Isn't the Greek language Indo-European in nature? Yes. But when you look at the core, this is very important, I think, because we've lost sight of that today in the United States. We keep talking about a multicultural society, and we don't understand that we have something much better called a multiracial society. By that is, we welcome all people from all different races, but we have a core group of values: constitutional government, free economic activity, audit of the military, a reliance on rationalism, triumphant transparency, individual expression. And then we're enhanced on the periphery: different food, different fashion, different music, different art. But nobody tampers with the interior. No, none of you, when you say multiculturalism, you don't want to say that you would like to have the same protocols of women wearing bikinis as they would in Tehran. You wouldn't want to have the religious exclusivity that they do in Saudi Arabia. You wouldn't want to have the scientific inquiry that takes place in much of Latin America or Africa. We say these are very controversial things, but we know them to be true. So we're talking about a multiracial society that surrounds this singular culture and is enhanced in a cultural sense, but it doesn't tamper with the main economic and political and social institutions. And they go back to Greece. And if you look at those, and not just Greek architecture or myth, you start to see something quite funny, strange, inexplicable. They're anti-Mediterranean. The Greek city-state, there's 1,500 of them, come out of nowhere. But the processes under which Greeks make laws are not like Hammurabi's law code. They're just the opposite. They're just exactly the opposite to the pharaohs. They're exactly opposite to the Mycenaean Greeks, who spoke the same language, although they had different script. They had the same type of agricultural plants, but they were very different. They were palatial in nature. They were probably theocratic. They were monarchical. And by the 7th, 8th century, 6th century, there's a radical revolution. Suddenly, out of this little place, 50,000 square miles, not much more than 2 million people, there's an explosion, 1,500 of these crazy city-states. And it refutes everything that came before in Greece and everything around them at the time. And I'm not just picking on Asia Minor or Africa. I'm talking about the tribal cultures of European society on the other side of the Balkans, and then later on the other side of the Danube and the Rhine. So what was this thing? Well, it was an experiment, an explosion. I don't know how to call it. Why did it happen when it did? Nobody can really explain it. Some people say a sudden increase in population. That happens all the time. But what made people turn to an alternative and entirely unique way of constitutional government, free economic activity, getting citizens to pass on property in their own name, free from government interference, sort of idealizing the middle group of people, discussing freely ideas without fear of government coercion. And most importantly, starting this process of constant evolution and re-examination of the system that they created. I wrote a book, The Other Greeks, and argued that it had something to do with an agricultural renaissance, that people broke away from palatial methods of agricultural production that had been common in the Middle East, and also from tribalism. And when population increased and they had to do something different to survive, they started in the inland valleys of Greece to plant olives, barley, grape, viticulture on their own piece of property. And the real impetus for democracy and what we've been talking about in the West, free expression, was not idealism, but it was to sanctify and to protect property owners. And once they did that, then they understood that everything flowed from that. Militias, monitoring military expense. But it was originally a desire to protect property, and then Greek culture sort of took off. I want to make 3 or 4 statements about what we can see at the beginning of Western civilization in Greece. And I think you can see these contradictions are with us today. The first thing is a constant notion of evolution. They haven't created this thing for much more than 2 or 3 centuries, and they're already tearing it apart. Every society in the Mediterranean, every society in tribal Europe, every society that we know in the New World, subjugated women. Most women outside the West are subjugated today in a way that is not comparable to Western. We worry about a glass ceiling, but we don't worry about female circumcision. I said that to an audience. Some woman got up and said, "Who are you to judge female circumcision? You're not a woman." But I think most women, if they're of age, choose not to have that done. But my point is that this is a constant reevaluation. And look at Greek tragedy. Titles of plays: Antigone, Electra, Helen, Hecuba, Lysistrata's comedy. And what are Aristophanes' comedy, Lysistrata? And what's the theme of a lot of these plays? That people are brilliant regardless of gender or sex. Antigone's got more guts than Creon does. Lysistrata's got more brains than these crazy Athenians and Spartans that kill each other. But the political system has not caught up yet. And that it's the duty of playwrights to put this truth out in front of the public. It's not just in Athens either. I mean, Sappho is not an Athenian. Corinna and Praxilla are not Athenians. It's not an accident in the West that Penelope is the model of decorum and good sense and brains, even in some ways better than her husband. So there's this early urge to examine the way the world is and say that something could be better, and I want to express what that better could be, and I want to do it without being put in jail or executed. Not that you wouldn't be 1,000 years after the Greeks, not that people wouldn't, but at the beginning they thought this was an ideal. Same thing with economics. Because once you create a system, and I'll talk about that in just a second, that's based on personal freedom and the pursuit of economic profit, then you're going to immediately butt up against this war that we have today, and it's not solvable. That is between liberty and equality. Liberty and equality. We're not all equal, and if we're not all equal and we're all free to do what we want, somebody's going to get ahead of somebody else. So there has to be some method to deal with this. And the Greeks almost immediately start to ask themselves, what type of constitution should we have? Should we have property owners? If so, should they have a high property qualification or a low qualification? And some of you would say, well, they didn't give slaves. Well, no, slaves didn't have a vote or citizenship anywhere, but there was a familiarity between slave and master that's quite shocking. If you can see something like Aristophanes' frogs when Xanthias just smarts off, or you can see Aristotle start off the politics when he says, you know, there is such a thing as a natural slave, contrary to what other people say. Well, who's the contrary to what other people say? There are people saying that slavery was not fair because it made people unfree who had greater talents than the ones that were their masters. One of the things that was so hard for the Greeks to develop, by the way, a sense of abolition, was this idea that you were going to tie slavery to race was somewhat a later concept in the West, later than other worlds. By that I mean that there was a great debate that the Greeks should not enslave one another, and they did. And that meant that they didn't really think that slavery was based on natural inferiority. And that's what Aristotle's trying to argue about. It should be. And Isocrates and these other thinkers as well. And it meant that it was an insidious process where all it was an accident of what? Birth, wrong city at the wrong time, that got sacked. So then how can you, if you go to a Greek and you say to him, I'm tutoring your kids geometry, and I know more about geometry than you do. I'm smarter. I've just proved that I'm smarter than you, master. The master says, so what? I'm not invested in any idea that says that you can't be smarter. You're just unlucky. And I can be where you are tomorrow, and you can be where I am. If you got enough money or you're in the right place at the right time. So that's a much harder concept to get rid of. And yet the Greeks already are attacking it. So that's one thing that we see of Western civilization at the very beginning, and that explains a lot of the contradictions and problems and paradoxes and ironies that we have today. The second thing is, I've talked in a peaceful context, but when this system that I've talked about in terms of politics and economics was turned loose on the military, it became just as dynamic and just as insidious and just as aggressive and just as dangerous. Because when you start to redefine in an egalitarian sense what military prowess is, not just a warrior with a bunch of heads on his belt, but somebody who marches in time and he takes orders and he's given a medal for going and saving the person on his right, he's in a regimental system. Aristotle's got a great talk about Greeks don't seem to get awards for how many kills they inflict. It's group discipline and advancing and retreating in cadence. And then when you turn Western technology, or the idea that religion or government should not intrude on natural inquiry, and religion shouldn't, but capitalism should, and you can make a lot of money on weaponry, then you turn loose human genius. And look at every military idea that we have today is Western. Every element of gunpowder except the origins, which is the exception that proves the rule, because in China it was a Mandarin enterprise, an entertainment enterprise. Within 200 years of its theft, because Westerners do like to steal, individual genius is not the monopoly of any people. There's no difference in race. But in the West, people have this facility and the lack of obstacles to steal, take, try, profit, anything they can. And almost every weapon system that we know of was developed and improved and modified today and in Greece by Westerners. And that gave this little society that had 50,000 square miles political power and influence overseas that's not commensurate with its small size or population. Explains why Alexander is on the Indus River, 326, 325, 324, and Xerxes cannot squash little Greece in 480, even though he has so much more material advantages. We talk about the Crusades today, but even in that low point of Western civilization, there's a reason why there were not a large fleet under Saladin up the Thames River. I know some of you are going to say, well, the Mongols and Hannibal and Xerxes, there's exceptions, and the Siege of Vienna. But by and large, over 2,500 years, the West has usually extended its power overseas to either colonize, plunder, kill, conquer, enrich itself, influence, convert, whatever term you like to use from whatever political take on. The question is not that it does, but how, why? Is there a God up there that says, okay, you Westerners, you're going to get to design RPGs, and the other people have to steal them or modify them from you or buy them with petrodollars, but you are going to have this. No, it's the system. Now, were there ways of checking this system? Absolutely. The Greeks learned them very quickly. The Romans had limitations on exporting Roman plate, for example, body armor. Greeks were upset that others might find out about catapults. There were rules and regulations about fighting foreigners. And there's this idea very early that people don't have to be a genius to take a Western weapon and turn it against yourself. Or more importantly, you could redefine war. If Western life was pretty good and you were more affluent and free, then you were less likely to want to lose it. So this idea of asymmetry in warfare. Alexander's only got 50,000 men. His fighting forces are 250,000. And when you read some of the descriptions of the lamentations after battles like Gaugamela or Issus, when they lose almost nobody, but the nobody they lose, they feel it very dearly. It's a very Western idea that Cortez can go into Tenochtitlan and the Noche Triste lose 600 and kill 10,000 people, and everybody thinks it's a disaster. Because usually Westerners are far from home, and they're relying on technology and superior weaponry rather than sheer numbers and organization and discipline. We see that today. That Greek idea is so with us today. You can be in an Apache helicopter, $2 million helicopter with a $250,000 bachelor's from West Point. And if somebody who's a child of 11 people with the infant mortality rate 10 times higher than, say, Los Angeles, if he shoots you down with an RPG and destroys you in that education and you're from a wealthy suburb, that country is going to feel that that's a much greater loss than if the helicopter lands on a house and takes out the shooter. And that has always worked against the West because it defines, not because it's more moral, but because, as I said, usually its soldiers and its population base are smaller. And just when I'm saying that there's this aggressive tendency in the West to create these superior conventional forces, there's also ways to check it. And we see them today, and the Greeks discovered them. One is a moral censor. Censure of military operations if they don't reflect Western need, Western interests, Western values, whatever the particular person who's making the critique. Then in a consensual society, you can stop these. Or at least if you can't stop them, you can complain. So if you're Euripides and you don't like the siege of Milos, you can write the Trojan women. Or Thucydides can talk about how stupid the debate was over Sicily. Or Aristophanes can say the Peloponnesian War makes no sense. Or people like Tacitus and Sallust can talk about making a desert and calling it peace. And that is deeply ingrained in the West as a check on this natural ability to reify your dreams of conquest with a superior military. It's no accident that when Cortez goes into Tenochtitlan and starts to slaughter Aztecs, there's Bishop Sayhogun who writes a letter to the Spanish crown saying this is awful, killing natives. Or when the British are very successful in Zululand, the whole Kalinsel family is trying to oppose the Zulu War of 1879 on moral grounds. In the same way we see in Vietnam and today. There's always this idea that the war has to reflect a majority opinion, or if it doesn't, it reflects a minority opinion, and then it can be a challenge on ethical and practical, realistic grounds as well. And that's with us today, and that came from the Greeks. Let me